64-bit technology, right? Like I mentioned in the introduction, Exchange 2007 is 64-bit only, right? That's what native implies, all right? So you cannot run Exchange 2007 in a production environment on 32-bit technology. You can download 32-bit code, but only to run in a test lab. Okay, so that's what native 64-bit means. Now, part of that means that you get a large cache, and we're going to have a look at what the impact of that is, and it's significant. Then the other thing, though, is the concept of addressable RAM. Now, what happens here is that 32-bit basically means 2 to the power of 32, which enables us to address a maximum of 4 gig of RAM. Now, 64-bit technology enables us to address 64, so 2 to the 64, which is 18 exabytes. Alright? Now, if you've not heard of an exabyte, that's because it's huge. Right? That's a huge amount of storage capacity. But this is just theoretical. Alright? Now, the reality, in terms of what you can configure, is this. So, with 32-bit technology, 2003 standard, we could do 4. With 2003 enterprise, we could do 64. And now these are the new, much larger numbers. But there's something else that needs to be explained. So, let's have a look. Now, with memory, with addressable RAM, what happens is that even though a 32-bit system can address 4 gigs, those 4 gigs are actually split into 2 and 2. Okay? Now, this is the operating system, and this is an application. So by default, what will happen is that the operating system will claim 2 gigs, and the application therefore gets 2. So even though we say 4, in reality, we're kind of talking 2. Now, those of you that know what the 3GB switch is just something that you put into your boot.ini file. And if you were to do that, then this gets reconfigured such that it's like this. So in other words, my operating system gets 1 gig, and my application gets 3. But it's a way of choking RAM out of my operating system in order to give it to my application. So it's literally a trade-off. Right? Now, in contrast, now with 64-bit technology, we're talking about a massive stack like that, all right? Such that we can address that in theory, but in reality we can address that amount of RAM for our application. So we're talking about a huge improvement here, right? And again, we're about to have a look at what the actual impact is. Alright, now this is one of the biggest impacts that you'll find on with 64-bit technology. So most people think, well, 64-bit means my CPU is going to work faster. But the reality is that the biggest gain that you're going to get is in disk I/O, alright, disk access. Now if we have a look at this, we're talking about Exchange 2003 running on 4 gigs of RAM. Okay. Now over here we've got Exchange 2007 also running on 4 gigs of RAM. So exactly the same. So these two systems are basically the same, except that this guy's 32-bit, this guy's 64-bit. Okay. Now even though my writes per second are more or less the same, look at that. Okay. My reads drastically reduce. Okay, drastically. So, and you might think, well, why, right? Well, part of that is because I now have a much larger cache available, and as a combination of that plus the fact that it's actually 64-bit, we're now getting a 47% reduction in disk I/O reads, okay, just by going from 32-bit to 64-bit. A 47% reduction, right? Now, if we go to that Exchange server that has 4 gigs and we simply add more RAM, and we've done nothing else, now we're talking about a 78% reduction in reads. Alright? As a matter of fact, not only are we talking about a reduction in reads, we're talking about a nice reduction as well in writes. Okay? So, if disk was a problem, which typically it is, you may not realize it, but typically it is, then going 64-bit is going to make a huge impact. Alright, now let's have a look at the effect. Alright, so Okay, first of all, let's just read the points here, okay? So, if we're reducing disk I/O, say, by roughly 70%, if you look at, Microsoft Material, we're basically saying we're using a quarter less disk, 4 times more users, and larger inboxes. Hey, fantastic. How are we doing that? Alright? How can less disk I/O basically now magically give you much more space, if you like, in order to have 4 times more users and larger inboxes? Okay? I remember the first time I saw that, I said, well, that doesn't make sense. Well, the issue is that bandwidth is the choke point, not capacity. Alright? Now what that means is that if we have a look at this diagram, you can see that this is the total amount of capacity. Now I've got plenty of free capacity here. Okay? But what happens is that I never end up using that. Why? Because I end up choking my bandwidth. Alright? My bandwidth basically runs out. So some companies are saying that they're only utilizing, say, 30% of their available storage by the time that their bandwidth basically just maxes out. And if they max out their bandwidth, they've got no choice but to basically get more and more disk. Okay, but they're only going to be using, again, 20 to 30% of that because of the bandwidth problem. So, by the fact that we are reducing disk I/O significantly with 64-bit technology, now what that means is that this bandwidth that previously was not available suddenly becomes available. Alright? So the effect on that is that, let's say that over here I may have been using, say, 8 72 gig disks for my storage, but again only getting, say, 30% utilization on my bandwidth. Then over here on the Exchange 2007 system, what I might do is I might do 300 gig disks. So I've actually got less spindles, alright, so less physical disks, and even though I've got less disks, right, I can actually fit 4 times more users and much larger inboxes. Why, Bill? Because I've got a lot more storage, right? You might be saying, well, hang on, isn't that slow? A 300 gig compared through to a 72 gig? Absolutely. But it doesn't matter. Why? Because the bandwidth has been improved drastically by going 64-bit. Okay? So I'm hoping that's made the situation clear now. When you see this, you don't just laugh going, well, that doesn't make any sense, and hopefully it does now. So just recapping here, so 64-bit basically means that we're using far less spindles, and therefore, since we're using less spindles, we can actually buy cheaper and slower disk, such as iSCSI and direct attach storage, and in doing so basically get things like much larger mailboxes or 4 times the amount of users that we originally had on Exchange 2003. Okay. Another thing that's very important in terms of cost saving is that as our memory runs out, so as RAM runs out, what we can actually do is add more RAM rather than adding more servers. Okay, so again, if that's not quite clear, right? So we've got Exchange 2003. Exchange 2003, let's say it had 4 gig of RAM in it. Now, let's say that it was running Windows 2003 standard, and suddenly we say, well, you know what, we need more RAM for Exchange, right? It's maxed out. Well, can we simply go to 8 gig? Well, no, right? Why not? Because 2003 standard only can address 4 gig maximum, right? So if you wanted to do that, you might say, well, okay, well, how about if I do Win 2003 Enterprise Edition, right? I know that can do 64 gig, right? Now, yes, that's true, but like we talked about before, each application can only address 4 gig, right? As a matter of fact, like I told you before, it can actually address 3 gig or 2 gig depending on the actual configuration, due to the operating system taking some of this RAM as well. So regardless of the fact that I've actually got 8 gig, my application is limited, right, to that. So therefore the only thing that I can do is, I had my Exchange box before. Well, I've got no choice. I've actually got to buy a new Exchange server, throw 4 gig into that, and basically, perhaps move half of the mailboxes onto it, and that's what I need to do. But I've had to purchase a new server right? In contrast, with Exchange 2007, right, I might start with 4 gig. Suddenly, if I max out my RAM, well, you know what? Let's go up to 12 gig. What the hell, right? And RAM is cheap rather than having to actually buy a server, right? So there are significant cost benefits there. Alright, new Outlook Auto Discovery. So, okay, what this thing here is, we actually touched on it when we talked about mobile messaging, but again, by entering your name, your email address, and your password, everything gets configured for you. Okay, so you can see it here in the screenshot. So I would go to New, click on that, enter my name, my email, my password, and I'm done. Easy as that.